Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. I hope you had a good fast yesterday and got over it now and back to some sort of normality, whatever that might be. Just a couple of things from me before I hand over to Simon. Daphne and Marlene sent out the October newsletter last week, so you've got the programme now for October. Just to remind you, we have another Desert Island Discs coming up during October. I hope you enjoyed last week's, those of you who tuned into last week's Desert Island Disc. I certainly thoroughly enjoyed it. What a wonderful variety of stories and music, very entertaining. So we would like to do a third one. So can I just ask any of you who are on today who have not yet contributed, if you would like to contact us on bushysage@gmail.com, giving us the piece of music and why you want us to play it. We'll be only too delighted to set up another session later on in the year. Okay, welcome Simon, delighted to have you on board today. Thank you for joining us. Simon's talk is called The Hidden Covent Garden. Simon's going to give us a walk around Covent Garden, an area that I'm sure most of us are familiar to, but I think we're going to find out about Covent Garden, things we never knew about and places that we haven't seen. So Simon, welcome again and over to you.
That's lovely, Stuart. Thank you very much. Well, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I'll check with Stuart and Ronnie that you can hear me clearly.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Perfect. Okay. And I might just ask both of you to keep yourselves muted and your videos on, just in case you need to contact me or alert me to anything during the virtual tour, just in case there are any technical glitches. But first of all, a very good afternoon to you all, and thank you for joining this virtual tour of Covent Garden. My name's Simon Whitehouse. I'm a London Blue Badge guide, and I know I've got at least one esteemed colleague with us today in the form of Sue, who I know now professionally and personally. And I guide, as we all do, all over London on all kinds of themes and subjects. But I have to say that Covent Garden is an area of London that's particularly close to my heart. I've spent a lot of time there professionally and personally. And as we go along today, I'll perhaps share with you a couple of my personal links to the area. And as you say, it's an area that you're probably very familiar with yourselves. Perhaps some of you visit Covent Garden regularly for shopping, for restaurants, and those of you with longer memories might even be able to remember, of course, the days of the working market. Oh, what am I saying? I'm sure nobody today here is able to remember that far back to the days of the market. But anyway, maybe towards the end, when we finish, we might have some sharing of some of your stories or memories or recollections. That would be rather nice as well. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to start sharing my screen. I don't know what your normal procedure is, Stuart, whether you ask people to switch off their videos. It does help with the bandwidth sometimes if you turn your video screens off. But so in about 50 minutes or so, I should say, we shall be back together again. So let me just take a moment to share my screen. And if you think of any questions along the way, you can use the chat function to pop questions in. I can't always see the questions as I'm going along, but I'll try and answer the questions at the end of our little session. Okay, so hopefully there you can see my first screen. Maybe a thumbs up from some of you. You can all see that. Just occasionally what happens, and you may have experienced this before with lectures or tours, is that occasionally there's a little delay as we go from one screen to the next, and that's sometimes to do with the bandwidth, sometimes it's to do with the way that the image is formatted, but just be a little bit patient with that. So that's my little introductory title page. You know who I am now, and this is a virtual tour inside Covent Garden. And I've put there on the screen straight away a building which I think for many people is the essence of Covent Garden. You might recognise that beautiful temple-like building. It's the Royal Opera House, and it's home to the Royal Opera Company and the Royal Ballet Company, and it's one of the leading theatres in the world. And we will be visiting the Royal Opera House towards the end of our virtual tour. I just thought you'd like to know that little statue that you can see just there on the screen is in fact just across the road from the Royal Opera House on Bow Street, and it's by an Italian sculptor called Enzo Plazzotti, and it was done in the 1980s, and it's a rather nice juxtaposition, I think, between sort of the ballerina and the facade of the building. But we'll talk a little bit more about the Opera House later on, but that's to begin. Now, I know you all really know where Covent Garden is, but I thought what's nice about a virtual tour is we can do things a little bit differently, and we can actually, at great expense, ladies and gentlemen, have gone up in the helicopter to give you this aerial view of the neighbourhood. But I think actually it is quite useful to understand geographically where Covent Garden is and why it's located where it is. So the area sits within the city of Westminster, of course, which is one of the two cities that make up central London. And as we know, the city of Westminster is the royal and the political district. And what we've got here are the approximate boundaries of Covent Garden. So I'm just going to run my cursor just along the top here. And right along here, we've got a street called Long Acre, which the name of which will become even clearer as we proceed. So that's the northern boundary of Covent Garden. And then just running down on the left-hand side here, so actually the western boundary is St Martin's Lane, which was little more than a cart track in the Middle Ages. And just along here, running along the bottom, is a wide street, of course, one of the main streets of London, the Strand, which of course connects the city of Westminster to the city of London. And then just here, there's a kind of a curved crescent shape on the right, and that's the Aldwych, and running up there just up to the top right is the Kingsway, and that kind of forms the eastern boundary of the area. And very close to, of course, is the river itself, and that's just in the bottom right hand corner of the screen. And the proximity to the River Thames is a crucial part of the story. So that's the boundary, and we're going to be spending most of our time kind of in this area, the area that we call the Piazza, which of course is where the Central Market building is located. By the way, just note from the air, this building here, that's actually the Royal Opera House. And what you can see from the air is exactly how much space that building takes up within Covent Garden. It actually covers about 2.5 acres of land right in the corner. Didn't always take up that amount of space. It's largely due to its expansion in the 1990s, but we'll talk about that. So that is our kind of geography taken care of. And now I'm going to just show you a rather colourful little street map, which is from a magazine, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later, which a friend of mine, in fact, founded, called the Covent Gardener. And this is really just a street plan of the area that we've just seen. So there's Long Acre. There's the symbol for the Underground. That's where normally, if I was doing a walking tour with you in real life, I would meet you, and we'd probably start our walking tour just there. And we're going to wander down James Street and have a look at Floral Street. And the names are quite important. They do have a significance and a relevance to the history of the area. And then we're going to come to here, which is the central Piazza. We're going to walk a little bit along King Street. We're going to visit this church, which is called St Paul's Covent Garden. We're then going to wander along Henrietta Street, Southampton Street to Maiden Lane, where we're going to visit the oldest restaurant in London. And then we're going to wander eventually back along here, back round the other side to Russell Street, and end up on Bow Street, where we're going to actually finish up at the Royal Opera House. So it's effectively a sort of a loop around the Piazza. Okay. And just on the map, by the way, you can see some of the characters that we're going to encounter, including the lady there in the green coat. You might recognise her. That's Eliza Doolittle, whose story, of course, begins in Covent Garden. All right, so let's carry on. And these are just a few of the highlights we've got in store for the tour. So that's quite enticing, that beautiful gold wire and copper brooch, which is beautifully set with enamels. And that might astonish you because that's a 7th century AD brooch. And that takes us right to the origins of Covent Garden. So more about that in a moment. And then we're going to find out why this coat of arms is so important, which sits right on the pediment of the Central Market building in the Piazza. We're going to meet my friend Janine, who's just there on the bottom right-hand corner. And then we're going to find out about this lady, who's another Eliza, but not the Eliza we just mentioned, Eliza Doolittle, perhaps not such a familiar story. We'll talk about her. And we're going to dive down a wonderful, dark, gaslit Dickensian alleyway. So we can do all of these things, of course, just from the comfort of our own homes at the moment. And we can visit day and night, which I think is, fantastic. Okay, so we're going to start at the intersection of Long Acre, which kind of is that street running up to the left, and this street, which is underneath the underground sign, and that's called James Street. And what I quite like about, London in general is that we still have things today which are echoes of the past. So you see here, just here, we have these rickshaws, which are very popular at the moment to take the tourists around wherever they want to go. And they sit here waiting for their customers. But historically, if you'd wandered up Long Acre in the 1600s, it was lined with carriage makers. I'm sure you've all heard of Samuel Pepys, the great diarist from the 1660s. Well, he told us in his diary that he went to Long Acre to pick up his newly made carriage. And actually in the 20th century, there were car showrooms on Long Acre. So there's a whole history of kind of wheeled transport on that street. And today, the only remnant we've got are these rickshaws, which buzz about the area. And the other thing I just want you to notice here is this rather wonderful building. Well, the building itself isn't maybe so wonderful, but what's on the building is quite wonderful. And that's about 5 years old. It's called a living wall. And if you've been, looking around in the last few years, you've probably noticed lots of buildings in London, if you look up, are covered in plants and flowers. And this was done about 5 years ago. And there's a company called Biotecture. And Biotecture specialise in combining the biosphere with architecture. And amazingly, the north side of the building, which is kind of there, and the west side of the building, which is here, is covered in 8,000 individual plants. In fact, about 25 different varieties. And you'll be delighted to know that 80% of the water comes from the rainwater, gravity fed from the roof. So it's really ecologically friendly. And it just livens up what would be just ordinarily a rather nondescript modern brick building. And I also think what's nice about it is that it also has echoes of the history of the area, because of course Covent Garden was for 300 years the fruit, vegetable and flower market of central London. So I think there's a nice little echo in that. So next time you're in Covent Garden, come out the tube and look straight up, and you'll see it there. It's fantastic. So we're going to just now wander down James Street. So by the wonders of Street View and Google Maps, we can now leap that journey, and we're now standing on the intersection of James Street and Floral Street. So you can see the living wall now just back there, but what we're really looking at now is kind of over to the right. Oh, someone's got a siren in the background. Who's that? Oh gosh. Somebody needs to mute themselves, I think. Okay, we're looking up here to the right, and you'll notice this very unusual structure which connects the two sides of this street, which is Floral Street. I'm going to come back to what that structure is in a moment, but Floral Street really is where the origins of Covent Garden lie, and I'm just going to show you what I mean by that. So on the left-hand side now, you can see a map of Anglo-Saxon London from the 7th century AD. Now, I'm sure you're all aware that London was founded nearly 2,000 years ago by the Romans, and the city that they founded, of course, we call that the square mile today, the City of London, but that's to the east of Covent Garden. And in fact, on this map, it's marked just there where I'm moving my cursor. Now, the Romans stayed for about 350 years, and they abandoned us in about 410 AD, and then we don't really know what happened for about 150 years. the so-called Dark Ages. But then what starts to happen is these Germanic farmers start to come over from northern Germany and Scandinavia, and they settle not in the old Roman city. They actually come further up the river. So I'm just taking us up the river here, and they decide to build a settlement on the north bank of the river on the site of where Covent Garden is today. And that's where the red arrow is indicating. And they called their settlement London Vic or London Vich. Now that literally means the port of London. And I'm sure you've heard that witch or Vic term elsewhere, because if you think about Greenwich, Greenwich, or Woolwich, Woolwich, it's the same root of the word. Now, we didn't really know anything about this Saxon settlement until about 30 years ago. And what happened about 30 years ago is the Museum of London did some excavations on Floral Street, that street that I've just shown you, and they discovered that brooch that I showed you just a little while ago, which I'm showing you again now. And they found it actually, we think it was, well, it was in what seemed to be a grave, and we presume that the grave belonged to a very high-ranking female, perhaps a female warrior or a princess, we're not entirely sure, but that was one piece of evidence. And the other piece of evidence we found was that when we excavated under the Royal Opera House in the 1990s, as the Opera House underwent this massive rebuilding programme, we discovered actually the archaeological layout of several streets, and also a haul of coins with the name London Vic on the coins. So that's how we know definitively that Covent Garden has been inhabited since at least 1400 years ago. And if you want to go and see those artefacts, by the way, including this beautiful brooch, you can go to the Museum of London, to the Anglo-Saxon galleries, and they're all on display there. So, surprising, huh? Surprising that Covent Garden goes back actually perhaps even further than we realised. And by the way, you can see all the other little Anglo-Saxon settlements just here on the map, in case you're interested, by the way. All with those wonderful names. You've got Camberwell, which is not too far where I'm coming from today in South London, and Peckham, and Clapham. Of course, ham is another Saxon word. Anyway, that's all an aside, that's all a diversion, really. Okay, so moving on. This is another view of the same street. This photograph was taken by my other half, actually. He's a wonderful photographer, and it's taken from the opposite end of Floral Street. So just imagine this is where they found that Anglo-Saxon brooch in the 1980s. So what is this structure that I mentioned earlier? What's that bridge? Well, that's a wonderful piece of 21st century architecture, and it's called the Bridge of Aspiration. Now, why is it called that? Because the building on the left is the Royal Opera House, and that's where the Royal Ballet School is located. And the building on the right is the home of the Royal Ballet School. Just on the left-hand side now, you can see the entrance to the Royal Ballet School on Floral Street. And the school has been there since the year 2000, although the school actually dates back to the 1930s. And at the Royal Ballet School, they train ballet dancers from the age of 16 to the age of 19, so it's a 3-year training program. They have 30 students in each year, so there are about 90 students in total. And each year, those young hopefuls at 18 all hope or aspire to be offered a place next door in the Royal Ballet Company. And only about 2 or 3 of the young hopefuls actually get offered a place. So it's known as the Bridge of Aspiration. And one of the more recent young graduates, a few years ago now, is this young lady here. I've just allowed her to pirouette into view for you. She is Francesca Haywood, and she is a principal ballerina in the Royal Ballet Company. If you saw the movie musical Cats in the last year or so, they did a film version of the musical, she starred in it. Just in case you saw that. And by the way, just so you can see what it looks like from the air, there's another aerial shot of the bridge. I don't know what you think it looks like, but a lot of people think it sort of looks like maybe a concertina or maybe an accordion or something. Apparently the thinking behind it was that it should be like a ballerina turning on a point shoe as it crosses from one side of the street to the other. The dancers, by the way, call it the Bridge of Perspiration, as opposed to the Bridge of Aspiration. It's also known as the Bridge of Thighs, as opposed to the Bridge of Sighs, which I think is rather fun as well. So we're going to carry on our journey now, having left the intersection. Oh, before we do, my friend Janine has her offices on Floral Street, and she's one of the 14,000 people that actually live in Covent Garden. So it's still very much a residential area. About 14,000 people live there, and she's lucky enough to have a nice flat just in the middle of the neighbourhood. And I point her out because she, about 5 years ago, started up this wonderful magazine. It comes out 4 times a year, and it's called The Covent Gardener. And you can subscribe to it if you want to. And it's beautifully illustrated, you can see just there on the front cover. And it's full of great articles, and you know, it showcases the shops and the particularly the independent retailers and the restaurants and the cafes. And she's just an absolutely gorgeous girl. And it's nice to see somebody that came up with a really great idea. So you'll find the magazine if you go into quite a few of the shops or restaurants. It's normally available for you to pick up, or you can subscribe to it if you wanted to. So we'll come back to that a little bit later. Okay, so now we're going to just, by the magic of Street View, just take a little walk down James Street. So we're going to just sort of look up to the left there, and now we can see the back side of the Royal Opera House as we swivel over to the left. And we're heading down towards that central Piazza area, just looking up there, what would have once been, in fact, a warehouse for produce. And now we're swinging back to take a look back up where we've just walked from, looking towards the Royal Opera House, and now looking towards an arcade known as Bedford Chambers. And we're just going to scoot along a little bit further. Sorry about my rather bad driving on my Google Maps, but just showing you now the western side of the Piazza, and you can see that there's a church there, and we're going to visit that church in just a few minutes' time. So moving on. Now, what happens next in the story? Well, by the early Middle Ages, this area is owned by the church. Now, of course, I'm sure you all know that in the 10th century, a group of monks founded a monastery at the site of where Westminster Abbey is located today. And the monks essentially own much of what we now know as central London. And the area of Covent Garden was known in the Middle Ages as the Convent Garden of Westminster Abbey. And there was, in fact, a building in the middle of where the Piazza is today. So you can see the boundary is marked here by green. And you can see largely it was an area of it was all open countryside. There were orchards, and you can see that the little sort of convent building just in the middle there, and you can see the Strand, which is very much developed by that point on the south side. So what happened is that they grew vegetables and fruits for the table at Westminster Abbey, and whenever there was a surplus, they sold the produce to local people. So I suppose you could say that there was the beginning of a market even as early as the Middle Ages. But this image is taken from around 1560. So now what happens is that, of course, in the 1530s, King Henry VIII comes along, and of course, he turns our country completely upside down. And in 1533, he, of course, separates from the Roman Catholic Church and makes himself the head of the Church of England. And of course, all the land that is owned by the church, the monks, now belongs to King Henry VIII. So he seizes all the land. And we know, of course, that he dissolves many of the great monastic houses. And he decides to give this land to some of his best friends. And the best friends in question, the winners of the lottery, were the Russell family. And the Russell family eventually became earls and eventually become dukes. So they become the landowners of the old Convent Garden, but they don't do much with it. They don't do much with it until the 1620s. So we're going to leap ahead in time, and we're going to meet this man on the left-hand side. And this is the 4th Earl of Bedford, and his name is Francis Russell. So the Russell family become the Earls of Bedford. And he decides he wants to develop this patch of land, make some money out of it. So he gets a license from King Charles I, cost about £2,000, and he decides to work with this man, who you now see on the right-hand side. You might recognise his image. that is Inigo Jones. And Inigo Jones had been the surveyor of the works to King James I and then to King Charles I, and he was really the first classical architect of Britain. So they worked together to create what effectively becomes the first planned square in London. So this is quite revolutionary. And I'm just going to show you there now the Central Market building in the Piazza at Covent Garden, and you can see there's a coat of arms on it. And underneath it says, Que sera, sera. Now that's nothing to do with Doris Day. That is that's the Bedford family's coat of arms. So you'll see that on quite a number of buildings within Covent Garden. You have to often look up, of course, to find it. So you can see the ducal coronet and the motto. I think the reason it's called, they have Que sera, sera is because in the 16th century, the family were involved in Spanish diplomacy, and they were Spanish speakers. So by 1660, so from 16, let's say 30 to 1660, the area is developed. And we can see an image here of the church, which I just showed you earlier, which we are going to visit again. But just on the right-hand side of the screen, you can just see a kind of row of colonnaded houses. And those are the buildings which really were revolutionary. So I'm just going to show you another image now on the left-hand side. This is where the arcade of the Royal Opera House is today. And what was revolutionary about this development was that the buildings, there were 3 blocks of townhouses. They were built of brick, but they were faced in stone. And they were accessed by these covered walkways. And just to give you another view of one on the right, that's the Bedford Chambers as it was sort of in the 1950s, I suppose, still with echoes of that original 17th century architecture. Now, what we have to understand, of course, is that, you know, most people at this time in London were living in the city. They were living in the Roman medieval city. And although there were brick and stone buildings, a lot of people were still living in timber frame buildings with thatched roofs. So this was quite revolutionary. So anyone that was anybody wanted to move in to this new development. And by the way, Inigo Jones was very much influenced by Italian architecture. So that's why you have these covered walkways. If you've ever been to those towns in northern Italy, like maybe Padova or Vicenza, anywhere like that, he was directly influenced by those town squares. So, and he gave the name to the middle of the square, which we still use today, which is called the Piazza. English people had no idea what a piazza was, but the name stuck and we still use it today. And by the way, that's the same building on the bottom there, Bedford Chambers. Now, it's not, none of the 17th century buildings survive, but that's a sort of an early 20th century reimagining that you can still see the echoes of the colonnades. So this was important architecturally. And there's a nice view of the piazza with the 1, 2, 3 blocks of houses, the church on the left-hand side. And you'll notice that in the middle, there are quite a few people sort of with market stalls, because what starts to happen, and this is an 18th century engraving, is that following the Great Fire of London in 1666, I'm sure you all know about that, of course, 80% of the city is destroyed. And now people need somewhere else to move to, particularly market traders. So they move westwards and they find themselves hanging out in the middle of this open square. And you can imagine what it's like if you were a resident of this very fashionable square. You're not best pleased that, you know, fruit and veg sellers have suddenly set up shop in the middle. And fairly quickly, actually, the area starts to go downhill. But not before, in 1670, King Charles II has decided he's going to capitalise on this commercial venture and actually formally issue a royal charter for a market to be held in the middle of the square every day. And in fact, that starts in 1670 and it goes on until 1974. So that was the span of the Covent Garden as a market. And there you can see the market there again in a slightly different image, rather, again, sort of bustling and busy. And notice it's still an open market, and that central market building that we know today, the one that's got all the lovely, the shops inside it, that doesn't come along till 1830. So it took a while for us to build a central building. Okay, now I promised you I would talk a little bit about this church, because although all those original 17th century buildings are no longer with us, this building is from the 1630s, and it's the only surviving building, and it's the church. The Earl of Bedford wasn't very keen on having to build a church on his new development, but he didn't have any choice in the matter. And he famously said to Inigo Jones, who was again the architect, he said, "Build me nothing better than a barn." And Jones said, "Well, you should have the handsomest barn in London," he said, and this is the result. And you'll see, it's a rather plain church in many ways, and it was sort of modelled again on Italian country churches. And you'll see these columns here. These are very plain Tuscan columns, about the most plain sort of column you can get, and this rather simple sort of pediment. But the idea was that you would enter the church just here in the middle from the Piazza, and the great and the good would be seen, of course, by everybody else. And the Bishop of London came down, took a look at the sort of the initial building, and realised a fatal flaw in Mr. Jones's architectural plan. I don't know if anyone knows what it is, but when if we were walking into the church from this direction, we'd be going in and facing in which direction? We'd be facing westwards, and the altar would have been at the west end of the church. That was an absolute no-no, because all Christian churches oriented towards the east, and this was the first Protestant church to be built after Henry VIII's Reformation, and so it was vital that we got it right. So the bishop says, sorry, no can do, you'll have to block up your nice grand entrance, and people have to go around the back, enter from the back, and face east, as they are used to doing. So that's why the church entrance is blocked up still today. So we'll go inside the church in just a few minutes' time. And of course, what you notice here, of course, a very familiar sight in Covent Garden. And of course, during lockdown for the first little while, we didn't have any of them, but the street entertainers. By the way, it's very hard to get the spot to be a street entertainer in Covent Garden. You don't just pitch up and get on your unicycle. You actually have to audition, and they have 4 audition sessions a year, and it's very strictly controlled. And only the specialty acts, like the fire eaters and the unicyclists, get this spot here in front of the church. This is considered to be the prime location for a street entertainer. So if you've got any special talents hidden up your sleeve, then you'll know where to apply to next year. Right, now speaking of entertainment, actually the church has quite a long history of entertainment. And if we were to go right up into the portico of the church, we would see this inscription, which you can see on the right-hand side. It says, near this spot, Punch's puppet show was first performed in England and witnessed by Samuel Pepys in 1662. So we all know that Samuel Pepys, of course, was this diarist. He kept his diary for 10 years nearly. We know, of course, that he gave us the big stuff like the Great Plague in 1665 and the Great Fire in 1666. But he also recorded everyday life and all the entertainments, of course, and going out for supper and an exhaustive account of his sex life. But we won't go into that just now. But he did record this great occasion. And I mention it because this is an image on the left-hand side of, in fact, something that still happens every May in Covent Garden. And this is the Punch and Judy Festival. And you can see here a man who, in fact, I don't think is with us any longer, but he is a Punch and Judy professor. Now, did you know that Punch and Judy puppeteers are actually known as professors, because Charles II decided that they must be given an academic title. And he's dressed here he's dressed up as Samuel Pepys in his sort of long restoration wig, and look at all the Punch and Judy puppets behind him. And in the churchyard every year, they have all the Punch and Judy tents and the Punch and Judy stalls, and you have all the Punch and Judy professors come and perform the Punch and Judy show. Now, I don't need to explain to all of you folks what Punch and Judy is, because, you know, we all know what it is, but try explaining it to visitors from overseas. I tried to explain to American tourists. So it's a story about a man and a wife, Punch and Judy, and the wife decides to go out and leave her husband in charge of the baby. And when she comes back, he's been very abusive towards the child. And then they have a row, and then he's abusive towards her. And I try and explain that it's an everyday story of domestic violence, which was turned into a form of children's entertainment. That's my best explanation of Punch and Judy. I think it fell out of favour for quite a long time, but certainly when I was a child still, when we went to the seaside, you still saw the Punch and Judy man. It's probably banned now, wouldn't it? Well, not in Covent Garden anyway. It's still alive and well. Every May they have the festival. Okay, right. Now another familiar sight, of course, that you would have seen had you been in Covent Garden in the late 19th and early 20th century were, of course, these flower sellers. And that's a photograph, very early Edwardian photograph of flower girls, or flower women, perhaps, just outside the church on the left-hand side. And of course, they weren't just in Covent Garden, they were all over London. And that's another flower seller just on the right-hand side, sitting in front of Eros on Piccadilly Circus. Now, the flower sellers, actually, there was a whole hierarchy of flower sellers, and the better off ones would get their sort of pick of the flowers early morning from the wholesalers, and they would sell their flowers during the daytime. But by the late afternoon, early evening, particularly the younger girls, the younger flower girls, they would sort of pick up the scrag ends of the flowers that had been sold in the daytime, and they gather them together into little posies. And they usually do the evening shift, and they'd sell these little posies of flowers underneath, you know, underneath the covered buildings, and particularly underneath the portico of St Paul's Church. And I'm sure you really know what I'm leading up to at this point, because in the early 1900s, George Bernard Shaw is walking through Covent Garden past the church, and he hears the sound of these girls screeching away, selling their flowers. And he has this idea for a play. And in 1912, the play Pygmalion opens at Her Majesty's Theatre. The story, of course, of Eliza Doolittle, this 18-year-old Cockney flower seller who meets Professor Henry Higgins under the portico of the church in Covent Garden, and he challenges his friend Colonel Pickering. He can turn this Cockney gutter snipe into a duchess in 6 months just by changing the way that she speaks. And of course, Pygmalion was very popular, and it was turned much more famously into a stage musical in the 1950s, starring Rex Harrison and Julie Andrews. It opened on Broadway initially, even though it was a, you know, effectively, well, it was an English play, but it was an American musical. And then it came to London in the 1950s, and it actually opened at the Theatre Royal Drury Lane, just on the other side of Covent Garden. So how appropriate that My Fair Lady should first appear there. And I'm sure we've all seen, certainly one of my favourite musicals. And actually, there's a much darker story behind the story, because I don't know if you remember in the musical, but Eliza's always protesting all the time about everything, and she's always saying, I'm a good girl, I'm a good girl. And the reason she says that is because a lot of the flower girls were actually often also prostitutes, particularly a lot of the younger girls, because the age of consent up until 1885 was 12 years old, and a lot of families in the East End farmed out their young children onto the streets. And so so what Eliza was saying was that she wasn't one of those girls, she was a good girl, and she only sold flowers and nothing else. So I think that's rather nice. I just want to show you that image, because that is a photograph of Audrey Hepburn and the director of My Fair Lady, the film version of the musical from 1964. And do you see where they're sitting? They're sitting just in front of the church on the left-hand side. And you can see the cobblestones of Covent Garden, and you can see the building just in the background there, and you can see these buildings. Well, of course, it's all movie trickery. It's all movie magic. unbelievably, they're not sitting, of course, in Covent Garden. They're sitting on a set in Hollywood, and they took photographs of all the buildings in Covent Garden. They came over, took all the buildings, and recreated Covent Garden Market in the studio in the 1960s. It was one of the biggest budgets of any film ever produced, because so much of the money went on the set design. But I always like to sort of point that out because it's so realistic. Okay. I was just going to have a little clip of a little bit of Eliza for you, and just have a look at the background.
Shouldn't we stand up, gentlemen? We've got a blooming heiress in our midst. Would you be looking for a good butler, Eliza?
Well, you won't do.
I'm sorry if it doesn't play quite as cleanly as it might.
Mrs. wants to open up the castle in Capri. The doctor recommends a quiet summer by the sea. Wouldn't it be lovely?
Okay, you can all sing along now.
All I want is to go somewhere far away from the cold night air, with one enormous chair. How would it be lovely?
I can hear you all singing along, right? That's your musical interlude over. And now we're going to disappear actually behind the back of the church into the churchyard of St Paul's, Covent Garden. Now, I don't know if you've ever been into the churchyard. A lot of people haven't. They don't realise it's actually there. But there it is on the image now, taken on a lovely summer's day. So that's how you enter the church. And before we go into the church, very briefly, just on the right-hand side, you can see there's a blue box. Now, that's actually from the 18th century, that wooden box. And it was built for a very particular reason, to try and put a stop to a very nefarious profession which plagued London's churchyards right up until the early 1800s. I'm sure most of you will know what it is. You can mouth it at me, or you can just say it out loud to yourselves. Yes, it's to put a stop to the body snatchers. Yeah, or the resurrectionists, as they were known. And of course, these were the men that were privateers who went into the churchyards on the day of fresh burials, usually when the sun came down, and they dug up the freshly buried corpses, unwrapped them out of their shrouds, and they took the corpses. When in Covent Garden, they took them to Leicester Square, where Dr. Hunter had his anatomy school, and of course the corpses were dissected for the benefit of the anatomy students, the training surgeons. And the reason that they had to do it privately was because you were only allowed 4 criminal corpses a year to practice on if you were an anatomy student. But luckily that all changed in 1828 when they passed the Anatomy Act, and then paupers from workhouses, their bodies could also be used for dissection. So the body snatchers almost went out of business, really. So that's what that blue hut is, and it's still there in the churchyard. And it's a reminder, of course, that don't forget that, when you built a church for a new parish, as Covent Garden was in the 17th century, the local people were baptised in the church, they were probably married in the church, and of course, they were buried either in the church itself or in the churchyard, right up until the 1850s, when we get outbreaks of cholera, and of course suddenly tens of thousands of people die, within weeks, and the churchyards are full to bursting, and they decide in the 1850s to stop burying people in the churchyards. So if you go into the churchyard, you'll notice there are lots of gravestones around the outer edge of the church itself. So let's just pop into the church. Oh, by the way, if we went into the church and we looked on the right-hand side before we went into the nave, we would meet this little fella. Well, we would have done until about 3 weeks ago. And I'm sad to tell you that he's no longer with us. This is the church cat. And his name is Jones. And until a few years ago, he had a companion, another cat, who was called Inigo. And so Inigo and Jones were the church cats. Isn't that wonderful? Inigo died and now Jones has gone to join him. I just found that out the other week when I popped into the church. So I'm sad about that. But So normally we would catch him napping in the vestry. There's the inside of the church. Now, although the church is from the 1630s, so it's in that wonderful classical Baroque style, so rather plain as churches go, but don't forget, you know, it's a Protestant church. And there was a fire in the 1700s, so but it was rebuilt inside because they had the original blueprints. So ostensibly what you're seeing there is the original Jones design, and you can see those beautiful chandeliers. You can just imagine, of course, they would have been all lit with beeswax candles, of course, for the services. And it's still very much a working church. That they have a lunchtime service at 1 o'clock every day. And because of where it's located, because of course Covent Garden is the heart of the theatre district, it's become known since really the 19th century as the Actors' Church. And just there on the left-hand side, you can see a close-up of a wooden cage, which is on the right-hand side of the chapel, on the right-hand side of the altar, and you can see there's a silver urn. And in that silver urn are the ashes of the most famous actress of the late Victorian era. Her name was Ellen Terry, and you can just see an image of her on the right-hand side. And Ellen Terry, I suppose, really was like the Judi Dench of the late 19th century. She was sort of famous, you know, for those classical Shakespearean roles, but her ashes are interred in the church itself. And one other actress's ashes are also underneath the altar, and that's Dame Edith Evans. And I'm sure you all remember Dame Edith Evans, most famous for having played Lady Bracknell in the film version of Oscar Wilde's The Importance of Being Earnest. And of course, every other actress has lived in fear ever since of having to utter that immortal line, "A handbag." And of course, lots of plaques in and around the church itself to very famous members of the acting profession, including, of course, Sir Noel Coward. That's just one example of many. Of course, he was 14 talents rolled into one: author, composer, actor, screenwriter, playwright. And he was known to all of his contemporaries as the Master. He wrote wonderful, witty songs, which I'm sure many of you will know, including Put Your Daughter on the Stage, Mrs. Worthington, and Bad Times Are Just Around the Corner. I wonder what, I think he'd be rewriting the lyrics at the moment, wouldn't he, if he was writing a song at the moment. But anyway, if we come out of the church and go towards the back of the church, we would step into a wonderful alleyway. And this is the alleyway now on the left-hand side, and it's called Godwin's Court. And it's one of those alleyways that I promise you, you may well not have been down, because it's really, you'd never find it if you didn't know where it was. And it's called Godwin's Court, and it's one of the oldest, it's actually the oldest street in Covent Garden by name. And it first mentioned in the 1690s. And you couldn't get a more, you know, dark Dickensian sort of style alleyway than that. And it's still lit today, as you can see on the left, by these working gas lamps. And I'm sure you know, but we're so lucky in London that we've still got 1,500 working gas lamps in the city of Westminster, and a very high number of them are still in working order. In fact, all of them are in working order, thanks to these guys you can see in the picture, and those are gas fitters, and they're responsible for going around and maintaining all of the gas lamps. So what that guy's doing actually is he's probably cleaned out the glass, but he's also resetting the timer at the bottom of the gas lamp, and the timers are set to sort of dawn and dusk, and once the timer kicks in, the flame at the bottom ignites from the gas jet. So they are still gas lamps, but they're just, you know, on timers, and the gas flames react with these little white things which look like electric bulbs, but actually they are they're little sacks of silk coated in a lime chloride, and the flame reacts with the lime chloride, and you get that lovely gas light. By the way, there's a lovely link to the theatre there, because in the early 19th century, there was an experiment where they tried to light the stages by putting a flame to blocks of lime, and you got this very sharp incandescent glow, and it would light up one or two people directly onto the stage. So it was like an early form of a spotlight, really. But of course, it became known because it was a block of lime, as the limelight. Being in the limelight is where that comes from. So the echo of it is still in the gas lamps today. And that's actually on the right-hand side there, the very last lamplighter that was still working in Covent Garden until about 30 years ago. So at that time, they were still going around physically lighting the gas jets in the evenings and turning the wicks down in the morning. Now, on to one of my favourite topics about Covent Garden. By the 1670s, 1680s, the neighbourhood is already going downhill because the market's arrived, and a lot of those fashionable people have now moved out of those lovely townhouses, and the townhouses are starting to be inhabited by slightly undesirable types. And by the early 1700s, that piazza is known as the Square of Venus. And that's because most of those houses are now inhabited by ladies of the night. So much so, in fact, and I put it on the screen for you to see, is that there was a guidebook published in the 18th century, and it was called Harris's List of Covent Garden Ladies. It was like a sort of a Georgian version of Tinder. So if you were a man about town and you wanted to know where all the best ladies were and what their services were and what special tricks they offered, you would consult this guidebook. It was published for about 35 years. This is an edition from 1773. It was published by a man called Samuel Derrick. And I'm just going to read you a couple of extracts from an 18th century edition of Covent Garden Ladies. It says here that if you wanted a lady with a fuller figure, you would seek out Mrs. Clecamp, and she was described as one of the finest, fattest figures, as fully finished for fun and frolic, as fertile fancy ever formed. It says, she is painted by the masterly hand of nature, shaded by tresses of the darkest brown, with the neighbouring hills below full ripe for manual pressure. So you can gather that it was quite an explicit guide, and the most extraordinary explanation is this one. So if you're of a sensitive disposition, put your fingers in your ears. Betsy Miles lived on Henrietta Street, just on the other side of the church, actually, and she was known for her immense-sized breasts, which she alternately makes use of with the rest of her parts. She is what you might call backwards and forwards, posteriors not excepted. Indeed, by her own account, she has most pleasure in the latter. Entrance at the front door tolerably reasonable, but nothing less than £2 for the back way. I don't think that needs any further explanation. And in case you're wondering if you think this sounds a little bit familiar, if you've been watching the BBC in the last few months, and goodness knows who hasn't in lockdown, you might have come across this TV series, and it's called Harlots. It's absolutely fantastic if you haven't seen it. And it stars wonderful Samantha Morton as a Covent Garden lady and Leslie Manville as a much sort of higher end Soho lady. And it's all based on the Covent Garden ladies from the 18th century. So it's compulsive viewing, I have to say. It's fantastic. Okay, now moving on now. So a little bit of a sense of what this what the market was like. Well, of course, by I would say the mid 19th century, the Covent Garden market was really at its height. And this image on the left really gives you, I think, a sense of the hustle and bustle of the market. And the market was really divided into sections so that different types of fruit and veg sellers would occupy different sides of the market, depending on the produce. And there's just some wonderful people. I mean, these are real people who've been photographed, really, I suppose, they were photographed over a period of about maybe 10, 15 years by a guy called Clive Bornell. And I love this lady here with the cauliflower on the bottom right-hand side. And remember, the market was still a working market right up until 1974. And what happened is that Covent Garden just was so overcrowded and so dirty and so congested. I mean, people that went to the opera, in the evening were walking across, cabbage leaves on their way in. And they decided that actually it needed a new home. So the market was moved out. And moved down to Nine Elms, where it still exists today as New Covent Garden Market. And one of the great characters of the market in the late 19th, early 20th century was this lady. Now, this is Eliza, not Eliza Doolittle, this is Eliza James. And Eliza James made a fortune selling watercress. Now, this is a lovely illustration of it from my friend's magazine, the Covent Garden. She was from Birmingham originally, and she was from the poorest of the poorest family. She literally wandered barefoot as a child, 5 years old, walking the streets of Birmingham, and decided when she was old enough, presumably she either walked or perhaps got on a, hitched a ride on a cart, came down to London and started doing exactly the same thing in Covent Garden. So she'd go to the wholesalers. So she'd go to the wholesalers at Farringdon and she'd buy up these great big bunches of watercress, and then she'd come down to the market and she'd sell them to anybody that wanted to buy a handful. And now I'm sure we all know what watercress looks like, but there it is on the right. Watercress in the 19th century was a bit like, how you grab a latte today or a cappuccino to get you kind of, quick hit. Well, watercress, of course, is packed with vitamin C, and it was cheap. And that's what people did. They bought these great big bunches of watercress on their way to work. And they made very little profit, the girls, from selling watercress. But she was smart, Eliza, and she didn't just sell to people on the street. She actually sold to hotels and to restaurants and to shops. And eventually, when the railway came along in the 1840s, out to Hampshire, she actually invested in some land. She'd actually made enough money to invest in land, and she invested in a watercress farm. And now the watercress was being brought from Hampshire into Covent Garden directly. And by the time she died in 1927, she'd made £20,000, which would be about £3 million today. And at her funeral, there were over 200 market traders at her funeral. And so she's one of those fantastic stories of, rags to riches. And amazingly, the company, James and Sons, still exists today in Hampshire. And they still have the watercress beds out there today. Isn't that a great story? Just fantastic. That's Eliza James. This is my friend Clive, who for about 40 years has been, he basically started to photograph and film the market during its sort of last days in the 1960s and 70s. So I thought, I'll let him talk to you for a minute.
It must have been about 67, 68, 1968. I was one wonderful summer morning, right at the top of James Street, by the tube station, looking down James Street into Covent Garden. And I thought, wow, this is a fantastic place. I knew Covent Garden. I'd been going through it for years, but suddenly I saw it differently. And I thought, I've got to work here. I just loved the way people move. I loved the interaction between produce, money, and people, and the work that, and that whole thing of connecting with people. And so I began to photograph. And I just developed this whole love of the marketplace. It was out in the open, a lot of it. It wasn't such an enclosed thing. There were streets, and of course all the shops or all the wholesalers had their wares out into the street. So of course it meant that it was out there in all weathers. And I think this was one of the keys that the old market, the people of the market, was that I wasn't what they called a fair weather photographer. I was there in the pissing rain. I was there on cold, snowy mornings. I was there.
So that's Clive. I still see Clive wandering around with his photography students, actually. He teaches photography and he takes his students still around the market today and does little masterclasses with them. And he's produced a couple of really good books charting the whole story of Covent Garden in the last sort of 40 years or so. So if you're interested, you can buy his book on, Amazon or whatever. Now, we've come round now from the church, so from the central market. We're now on a street called Maiden Lane, and just on the left-hand side, you can see the frontage of the oldest restaurant in London. Some of you may well know it. It's called Rules, and it's been there since 1798. And it's had its doors closed during COVID, of course, but I'm happy to report that Rules has just reopened its doors in the last 3 or 4 weeks. There's the canopy. These are photographs from one Christmas. And if you haven't been to Rules, you need to put it on your bucket list because it really is absolutely fantastic. You can see just there on the picture, it was founded by Thomas Rule in 1798. and it sold porter, so a dark beer, which was very popular with the market traders in Covent Garden, the porters, pies and oysters. And he said it was for rakes, dandies, and people of superior intelligences, whatever that meant. And he, the family, the royal family, owned it right up until the end of the First World War. Then this guy called Tom Bell took it over until the 1960s. His daughter took it over, and she sold it to John Mayhew, who you can see is the last name on the blackboard, and he's still the owner today. And just to show you inside, it's got 3 floors inside, around 90 tables, and it really is like stepping back into a time capsule. And if you like your meat, and particularly you like your game, that's what it's famous for. If you've never had grouse or woodcock or anything like that, Rules is the best place to try it. And every inch of every wall in Rules is covered with wonderful portraits and paintings and etchings and sketches. It's like a wonderful art museum in itself. And it's been used for lots of movies and television, including Downton Abbey and James Bond. In fact, the last James Bond film was filmed right at that table, actually, right at that table. We saw M sitting there having his supper before he's called away to be, taken away by James Bond. Anyway, that's a little bit about Rules. Oh, and by the way, one of the little artifacts in Rules is that chess set on the right-hand side. When I say it's a chess set, it is a chess set, but the chess pieces are made from miniature bottles of spirits. And the reason that they've got the chess set is because it belonged to Graham Greene, the writer. And Graham Greene always had his birthday lunch in Rules every year until he died. And this was from the film of Our Man in Havana, which was the film version of Graham Greene's novel. And so he got to keep the film prop and he gave it to the restaurant. And it's been in that glass case gathering dust since 1959. Right, now if we just come out of Rules, we cross over Maiden Lane and we go into this alleyway. And this is called Bull Inn Court. And again, one of those lovely hidden alleyways that we would perhaps not necessarily venture down on our own. But it marks the spot where a terrible tragedy occurred in 1897. And this is one of the great Victorian murder scandals. William Terrace, who was a theatre manager, met his untimely death outside the theatre. Now, just here on the right-hand side on the wall was, in fact, another entrance into the side of the Adelphi Theatre. And William Terrace was walking to the theatre on the 16th of December, 1897. He was starring in a play called Secret Service. He was starring in it with his lover and co-star Jessie Millwood, an actress. And what he didn't realise is that one of the other actors in the company was mentally unbalanced and wanted the starring role for himself. And he decided the only way to get the starring role was to get rid of the leading man. So as Terrace is about to go through the entrance on Bull Inn Court, and here it comes now on the right, you can see a newspaper sketch of the attack. Richard Prince stabs him twice in the back and once up the front, and Terrace staggers into the dressing room where his girlfriend is waiting. She screams in horror and he dies 20 minutes later. And before he died, he was supposed to have said, "I'll be back." And 30 years later, a man walking just along past Rules restaurant happens to see a very strangely dressed figure walking in front of him and follows him as he disappears down this alleyway. And the man claimed that this very strangely dressed figure in a grey Homburg hat, an opera cloak and an opera cane melted into the wall of the Adelphi Theatre. And Terrace's ghost has been reported as having been seen on quite a number of occasions by staff that work at the Adelphi Theatre on the Strand. So that's, by the way, they caught up with the killer, and he ended up in Broadmoor, the psychiatric hospital. And it's funny enough, he ended up putting on plays in the prison hospital and starring in them himself. So in a funny way, the killer sort of got what he wanted. Speaking of murder, I always love to point out that monument, which most people walk past having never looked at it. It's a monument to Agatha Christie, because Agatha Christie not only is the most successful novelist of all time, and her murder mysteries sell still today over 2 billion copies and counting, But what people also don't realise is that she was the most successful female playwright of all time. Now, I'm sure we're all familiar with her most famous play, which this is a monument to. So the whole monument is actually a big library, it's a book. Her murder mystery novels are around the bottom, but at the top is A Mousetrap. And of course, that's the play that she opened in 1952. Agatha Christie said, I'll give it 8 months. The producer said, I'll give it 14 months. And I'm delighted to say that it's about to open again after closure for 4 months at the St Martin's Theatre. It's been running for 68 years. It's the longest running play in the world. And that was unveiled, that monument, in 2012 to mark the diamond anniversary of the Mousetrap. And when Agatha Christie died in 1976, there were 4 West End theatres that were staging her plays, and they all dimmed their lights in honour of Agatha Christie. She actually wrote 19 plays, as well as those 66 novels. Okay, now to finish, we're nearly there, folks, so well done on hanging on in. We're going to finish in style by popping into the Royal Opera House, Covent Garden. And I've brought us around to Bow Street, which is where we would normally enter the Royal Opera House. This is a truck which is responsible for bringing the scenery from South Wales to the Royal Opera House. Did you know that the Royal Opera House stores all of its scenery for its ballets and operas, much of it in South Wales, about 4 hours drive away, mainly because the land is much cheaper to store stuff in South Wales than it is anywhere near central London. And these great big trucks, about 3 times a week, transport the big sets from Wales. And what they do is actually, you know how narrow the streets are in Covent Garden, they have to manoeuvre around the narrow streets. And just here on the left of the image is the new part of the building. And these trucks actually reverse into an elevator next to the theatre, and the whole truck goes into the building, and the whole elevator drops down into the basement of the Opera House, and the scenery is offloaded in the basement. It's absolutely amazing. And if you're ever there in Covent Garden and you watch the guys manoeuvring the trucks, I mean, that in itself is a huge skill. Okay, now a little bit about the Royal Opera House. The Opera House that we know today opened in 1858, but like so many theatres, it was the 3rd theatre to be built on the site. So the first theatre built on the site is this one. Now, this is an interior view of what was not known as the Opera House at the time. It was actually called the Theatre Royal Covent Garden. And it was a very small theatre, it was about 700 seats, and it was mostly home to plays, but it was home to opera. And what you see on the stage is a beautiful organ, which was donated by George Friedrich Handel. He actually gave that organ to the theatre, mainly because the London premiere of The Messiah was staged at the first theatre. Now, in 1808, that theatre burnt down. The reason it burnt down, because an actor fired a gun on the stage and the hot wadding got stuck in the roof of the theatre and the place burnt down to the ground. So in 1809, a second theatre was built. And this is the exterior of the second theatre. So this was a Regency theatre. You might recognise, if you look at the columns and the pediment and the kind of outside, it might remind you of another building that we still have in London today, just about 10-minute walk from the Opera House, same architect. Anyone? British Museum. So Robert Smirke, who designed the British Museum, also designed the second theatre on the site. That stood there until 1856. Guess what? Another fire. This time somebody dropped a cigar backstage and the whole place went up in smoke. So they had to rebuild again, giving us the theatre that we have today. But I want you to notice, just here is a little frieze on the exterior of the second theatre, and just here is a statue in the niche on the left-hand side. That's, by the way, the interior of the second theatre, which was much bigger, about 3,000 seats. And this is the facade of our theatre today. And what do you notice? They managed to salvage the frieze, and they managed to salvage the statues on the front of the building. So this building was designed by Edward Berry in 1858. And we can even magically now go inside the magnificent auditorium of the Royal Opera House. It's one of the largest theatres in the country. It has 2,258 seats. How do I know that? Because guess what? I used to work there, so I know quite a lot of detail about it. Of course, it's one of the most beautiful interiors of any theatre, all these lovely red plush velvet seats. And it was all beautifully restored in the late 1990s. About 6 months was spent simply on gutting the auditorium and restoring it to its former glory. So just imagine all the different lights you would have had here over the centuries. You had, you know, candlelight in the 18th century, then you had gaslight, and then you had limelight, don't forget. And now you've got, actually, these are all LED lights, which of course are very eco-friendly today. If we were to walk up the staircase from the main entrance foyer, we would come up to this beautiful landing and we would encounter this lady on the left. That's Adelina Patti. She was the great star of the Royal Opera from 1861 until the 1880s. She was an opera singer and a real diva. And very famously, she was always paid in cash up front before she sang, in gold sovereigns. Quite right too, in case the producers ran off with the money, I'm sure. But she made a debut at 18 years old. And I just wanted to show you that that lady just restoring Adelina Patti just a few years ago, just touching her up there. The Opera House, although I guess it's probably changed now because of COVID, but up until certainly recently, they had a full-time staff of around 1,000 people working in the building. Not just the ballet dancers, the opera singers, the musicians, but people like this, you know, taking care of the fabric of the building. And that's a lovely view, by the way, a sort of evening view of the Bow Street. And I want to show you this because this is what the entrance looks like now. It underwent this amazing redevelopment in the 1990s. And this exterior building, it was, well, actually, this upper part of the building is quite new, but the building is known as the Floral Hall, and it was built in 1859. So if you imagine the theatre was built in 1858, this was added in 1859 as actually a working indoor fruit market, and then later, I'm sorry, a flower market, and then later a fruit market. It was dismantled in the 1950s, and in the 1990s, they reimagined it to recreate new public space for the Opera House. And more recently, in the last 2 years, they've redone it again. And so, not at the moment, but normally we can enter the Opera House via these glass doors on Bow Street. And there's the most wonderful new cafeteria, which you can go in and enjoy as a member of the public. And it's a fantastic space. So I think they've done a great job of that. And they had started up doing tea dances in that wonderful interior space just before lockdown started. So I hope they'll resume those again. And that's a lovely view of the inside of the Floral Hall with a lovely mirror on the back wall. Now, just to bring you up to date, so 1974, remember I said that the market had moved out. And there was a real danger that the developers were going to come in and they were going to get rid of about 250 historic buildings in Covent Garden. And there were all kinds of mad ideas. They were going to build a double-decker motorway right through the heart of central London, which was going to go all the way through Trafalgar Square and down Whitehall. And Covent Garden was going to be demolished to make way for it. Can you imagine that? And luckily, local residents stood up and fought the developers. And actually, in the 1980s, the Greater London Council stepped in, good old Ken. I know he's not everyone's friend, but he did do an awful lot of good in helping to save Covent Garden, and a trust was set up. And I'm happy to tell you that the trust still exists today. And even though today, all of the central area where we go shopping and eating, all of this that we see now is all owned by a big company called Capco, and they own about 1 million square feet of Covent Garden, but they're not allowed to do what they want. They can't just let anybody go in and redevelop a building. It all has to go via the Covent Garden Trust as well. So they are the freeholders, but they are restricted in somewhat in what they do, which I think is very encouraging. Right, finally, a little bit of music to finish.
Thanks again, all the people who kindly put somebody in my needs contest. Very grateful. Have you seen the old man in the closed down market, kicking up the papers with his worn out shoes? In his eyes you see no pride, I love loosely at his side. Yesterday's papers, yesterday's news. So how can you tell me you love me and say to you that your sun don't shine? Let me take you by the hand, we'll lead you through the streets of London. Show you something to bring you change your mind. Have you seen?
And on that note, ladies and gentlemen, I hope, even though we are doing, of course, walks live again now in smaller groups, I hope we've been able to explore the streets of Covent Garden in a virtual way for you this afternoon. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'm going to bring you all back, or rather perhaps Stuart or Ronnie might bring you all back. And I'd first of all like to say thank you very much for your attention this afternoon. Hope you've enjoyed our exploration of Covent Garden. Hope you've learned a few things that maybe you didn't know before, and mostly what I hope is that you had a good time, actually. So if you have any comments, good, bad, indifferent, if you have questions, if you have observations, if you have anything you want to share, now's the time to do it, everyone. So
yes, please.
Hang on a minute.
I'll let Stuart field the questions, perhaps.
Let me just come in for a second. Simon, thank you so much. We have learned so much this afternoon. I have to say, we had a sage outing to the Royal Opera House last year when about 50 of us went there and spent a good few hours. We were shown around the whole building, down the basement, where all the scenery comes in, where it's constructed. It was such an interesting outing, and you've highlighted a few more things for us. Not least of all, Punch and Judy professors. I never knew that. Golly gosh, and so many other things. And I've always, when I've been along and seen street entertainers, always thought, oh, they just turn up and take a pitch and get on with it. But clearly there's a real rehearsal and profession that goes behind this.
That's
amongst
right.
So many other things. So,
and actually, you know, people like Eddie Izzard. Eddie Izzard's a really good example. He's a fabulous actor, you know, isn't he? And he started out, you know, as a stand-up comic in Covent Garden. Yeah.
And I think you've probably just increased circulation of the Covent Gardener quite a bit as well. So
I hope so.
So I'll stop there. And if anyone wants to ask you some questions before we let you go,
speak.
Go on then. Say who you are.
Yes, my name is Summer Criman, and I have a particular interest in the area, which you brought back some wonderful memories. Thank you very, very much. Because I used to sit from time to time in courts 1 or 2 at the same time at Bow Street Court. And I was rather hoping at some stage, as you wandered down Bow Street, it might include a mention of the courts there for very many years.
Hang on a second. Is that I think that's the Finks again, is it? Colin?
Yes.
Colin, can you put yours on silent?
There we go.
Okay. Right, go on. Sorry, carry on.
Could you? I don't know if you could hear me, Mr. Whitehouse.
Yeah, go on, carry on. Yeah.
Simon, please. Yes. Yeah. Yes. So you sat in court number 2. Did you say at Bow Street Magistrates Court?
Yeah, I sat in court 1 and court 2 from time to time at Bow Street, and I was just hoping that you might actually mention the court. But it was a fascinating memory for me as you went around the various streets, and I just wanted to say thank you so much.
Okay,
it's a pleasure. Thank you. Well, I'm happy to mention it. Of course, yes, the Bow Street Magistrates Court, of course, closed just a few years ago, mainly because I think the idea was that they needed to upgrade the courtrooms because of video surveillance in courtrooms, and I think it was going to prove too expensive to upgrade the historic building.
It's now a hotel.
It is now being transformed into a hotel, and I always forget the name. It's an LA-based chain. I want to say Nobu, but Nobu's the restaurant, isn't it? I don't know.
I've no idea.
Anyway, it's going to be a very swish hotel, and I understand that the main court number 1, of course, is probably going to be the main restaurant of the hotel.
Okay,
and there is going to be a museum, a police museum in the basement.
Yes. Yes.
Anybody else?
Sorry.
Got a question for Simon before we let him go?
No? I can see people waving.
Hang on. Go on, Daphne.
This is just Daphne to say thank you so much. It was absolutely fabulous. I thoroughly enjoyed every minute, and thank you very much for agreeing to talk to us.
It's my pleasure. My pleasure, ladies and gentlemen.
Can you come again and give us another talk on somewhere else in London?
Yes, happily.
Okay, we'll leave that to
We'll leave that to future discussions. Anyway.
Okay.
And I did like your reference as well to Doris Day on Case Sarah Sarah. How apt was that sort of? Even brought to
I know people always ask, you know, why is it Case Sarah Sarah? You know, it's so sort of you know, random, isn't it? Really?
Okay, Simon, thank you so much again, and we look forward to seeing you again sometime in the future.
Excellent.
Good
Thank you all, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.